Well, while many UK residents are still reeling at the shock that Britain will be leaving the European Union, one South African tech company is somewhat rejoicing. After it managed to correctly predict the outcome of the referendum, many analysts, polls and pundits had claimed that Britain was likely to remain in the EU. And for more on this, Brand's Eye CEO, Kloppers, joins me now from our Cape Town studios. A very good evening to you, sir. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, briefly tell us, how in the world did you manage to correctly predict Brexit while many others got it completely wrong?
Well, it's a good question. Thanks. It's great to be on the show with you. I think we almost took a chance this week, early in the week, when we started just tracking the conversation around Brexit from the UK, passing it through our technology, and realized, quite surprisingly, that 60% of people on Tuesday evening were saying that they were going to leave and not remain, which was totally counter to what we were seeing in other polls. So we kind of took a gamble and decided to go out to media with that stat, almost not knowing what it means, but then realizing as we drew closer to the results coming out that we actually had something quite substantial. And as you saw in the charts that have just come briefly across the screen, the sentiment actually changed on the day of the vote. But as we've seen before in the SA elections, it was almost too little, too late, as the Remain camp tried to really sort of get it over the hurdle right at the end there. But the public sentiment on the Leave side was just too big.
Now, JP, out of the 10 cities that you're monitoring, there were only 2 cities where the results didn't go as you'd predicted. What went wrong there?
Well, I think we're going to look into that this week. I think what we did in that exercise was looking at how the cities were mostly going with Remain and the outlying regions with Leave. And we saw that in the social data as well. And it really is. It was staggering to us how social media kind of really reflected what happened on the ground in the elections when the results came out, even down to a city level. And it really is the coming of age, if you like, of social media, where we saw working class people and just people on the street, that their votes and their conversations on social media aligned. And out of the 20 cities that we had a look at, only 4 of them didn't match up with what we saw, but that could just be the margin of error in the data that we were tracking.
Now, given that British people are largely conservative, I mean, what are the pointers that you focused on particularly to arrive at such a prediction?
So the way in which our technology works, and it's relevant to the question, we use humans to verify data, and then that verified data informs our machine learning algorithms on how to better judge the rest of the conversations. And so out of the 500,000 people that we tracked from Britain, these are just normal people throughout the UK who are speaking on social media. We tracked about 500,000 conversations, and we took a sample of 10,000 of those, put them through our crowdsourcing platform. And from that, I mean, people can read the nuance, and we see it in some of the tweets that are on the screen. It's actually quite hard for a machine to understand what a human's saying. But when people read it, they know, yeah, this is actually somebody who's sarcastic or they're frustrated. And so we use that kind of really accurate read of a person verifying the information, and we can do that en masse throughout the world to be able to use that to inform our numbers that we put out. And that was why we trusted it. I mean, we've learned over the years that we need to trust our data. So when it said 60%, we decided to go with it and to say, look, we think there's going to be an upset. We're not sure how much of an upset, but it certainly appeared like people were underestimating the Leave campaign.
And one of the fiercest criticisms of social media is that it is largely unrepresentative of the general populace. I mean, for instance, JP, according to YouGov polling data, 75% of youth who are between the age gap of 18 to 24 voted to remain in the EU, compared to the older 52% of Britons who voted to leave. Now, how then can we bank on social media as a true reflection of the will of the people?
I think just by its sheer size. It's not a small sample of people. We're talking about 500,000 people just from the UK on social media. And over the years, while it used to be predominantly the younger generations, we've certainly seen that change. The fastest growing generation on Twitter at the moment, I believe, is the 65 plus, which is staggering. So social media, I think, in this case it would appear representative. From the week, at the end of the week, it was 53.5% on our data that said leave, and the remaining said remain. So I don't think it's just the young people. I think more importantly, what we saw here was this kind of play between the younger generation and the older generation, where the younger generation were saying remain, and that they now have to live with a decision of the older generation that have made this call to leave. But even that, I think it's worth just pausing to think about just what that means, because we're seeing it play out in other parts of the world. We're seeing it play out in South Africa. We're seeing it play out in the US, where people are frustrated at having to go through the same pain again. So in the UK, we saw the older generation voting leave, and I wouldn't necessarily say it was the older generation. I would say it was, as we saw, the outlying regions, which is the working class and lower class people where the threats didn't kind of materialize, or they didn't internalize with them, because they thought, well, we're already going through economic pain right now, and so the threats of economic pain in the future don't work for us. We want to see real change. And that's the voice of social media, is saying we want to see real change. And we're going to see it in the South African elections as they come up. We'll see it later in the year in the US as well. So it is a fascinating era for social media and companies like ours who are involved in this kind of technology of measuring sentiment.
Now, speaking of South African elections, have you started to collect data on the upcoming government elections in South Africa? And if yes, what are you seeing at the moment?
We have started collecting data. It's too soon. Our analysts have been flat out looking at the UK this week, but we'll come out in the next couple of weeks with some more information on what we're seeing in social media here in SA.
All right, JP, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Great.
Well, that is JP Kloppers, the CEO of Brain's Eye, sharing his insights on the voting patterns that emerged during this week's EU referendum. We'll take a short break now, and more news will return after this.